First, a warning. The following episode contains difficult subject matter, including references to suicide, death, and descriptions of serious injury. It's the evening of March 12th, 1997. The Bre-X bosses are reeling from the bombshell that there might not actually be any gold in Busang. Not that it bothered Michael de Guzman, their geologist whose dream led to the gold discovery. He was living it up in Toronto. Freeport geologist Joe McPherson was also out on the town that night.
Boys being boys, they tend to go out to the gentlemen's clubs, and did meet Michael there one night, and he was clearly enjoying himself. He had a little private booth, and he was doing, the dancers thing, and I was only there for about an hour, but he'd been there for most of the afternoon, I think, and into the evening. I kind of got the feeling that it may have been kind of a last hurrah thing for him.
De Guzman, dripping in gold, was spending thousands on Cristal champagne with the ladies in the strip joint. Rumor has it, he became so fond of one of the strippers he proposed to her and asked her to come back to Indonesia. At this point, de Guzman already had a wife. In fact, he had several.
We knew of at least 3. Some people said there were 4. So there was Philippines, Kalimantan, Bogor here, and apparently someone in Brazil.
After that heavy night out, de Guzman received his orders from John Felderhoff and David Walsh from Bre-X. He was to return to Busang to meet with Dave Potter and the rest of the Freeport geologists to explain everything. The next day, de Guzman was put on the last flight out of Toronto, bound for Hong Kong. This was the start of his long journey back to the exploration site. But he would never arrive. In 4 days' time, Michael de Guzman would be dead. I'm Suzanne Wilton from the BBC World Service and CBC. This is the $6 billion gold scam, a story about the lengths people will go to in pursuit of getting rich, and how greed can obscure the truth. This is episode 5, Waiting for Michael. From Hong Kong, de Guzman traveled to Singapore, where he had an appointment at Mount Elizabeth Medical Center. He suffered from recurring malaria and was reportedly struggling with a hacking cough. Waiting for him in Singapore was his wife, Jeannie. She had traveled from the couple's home in Jakarta. Unlike his other spouses, Jeannie knew all about Michael de Guzman's multiple wives. Her words are translated by an actress.
Perempuan di mana-mana saya kasih bebas.
He had many women everywhere. I gave him freedom for that. He had plenty of money, a great career. He can play around with any woman while he can still see his kids, so he was happy.
Jeannie had brought along with her de Guzman's pay packet, which she had picked up on his instructions from the Bre-X Jakarta office, $7,000 in cash. De Guzman decided to stay in Singapore for 2 days, perhaps to spend some time with his wife. This didn't please Freeport boss Jim Bob Moffat. Back in Busang, Moffat's due diligence team were waiting for de Guzman. They wanted to quiz him about why they weren't finding any gold. You can hear Moffat telling Richard Behar about this in the Bre-X tape archive recorded by Behar while reporting on the story in 1997.
So we waited 4 days for de Guzman.
You mean it was 4 days before he came?
4 days before de Guzman got there. And guess where Felderhoff was? In the Cayman Islands.
He went to the Cayman Islands? He didn't come straight out?
Went to the Cayman Islands and sent de Guzman.
Oh my God.
I was so pissed off I could eat dirt.
I can't believe that.
So that's why it was so difficult for me to try to. I don't know what happened, man. I tell you, I had it with these guys.
Jim Bob kept phoning de Guzman, demanding he return to the job site the following day.
Mereka
When Mike came from Canada and I was in Singapore, he was called by Freeport's Jim Bob Moffat, and he asked Mike to go up to Busan the next day. We were on the last flight from Singapore. We arrived at 1 a.m., and at 4 a.m., Mike left again because Freeport was waiting for him. Mike was outraged. I haven't had any rest. I must see Big Boy.
Saya harus ketemu Big Boy.
Big Boy was Michael and Jeannie's son.
Kamu besok
They
harus-
say, no, you can't. You have to fly tomorrow because they've been waiting for you at the Busan site.
di lapangan.
I first became aware of Bre-X when I was working as a national business correspondent for Maclean's magazine. I was a feature writer.
Jennifer Wells was following the Bre-X story for an article. She pieced together de Guzman's last evening and final day. According to her, at 1 a.m. on March 18th, de Guzman and Jeannie arrived in Jakarta. By 4 a.m., they had gone their separate ways. De Guzman's next stop was to be Balikpapan, the seaport city in East Kalimantan, and the last big flight before Busan. De Guzman left Jakarta in the early evening. When his flight touched down in Balikpapan, he was met by his Bre-X colleague, Rudy Vega. Vega was part of the core Filipino exploration team at Busan. De Guzman had asked him to come out so the two men could get their facts straight ahead of De Guzman's showdown with geologist Dave Potter the following day. Potter was leading Freeport's due diligence. But as the meeting dragged on, De Guzman suggested they go out for a drink. At 8:03 p.m., they checked into a hotel, then spent the evening eating and drinking and singing until 1 a.m. the next morning. Which brings us to March 19th, De Guzman's last day.
The last night of Mike de Guzman's life didn't sound all that different from the life of Mike de Guzman when he was visiting Toronto and hanging out at the strip club. You know, they went to a karaoke bar. He's singing apparently a number of Indonesian songs, but also sang My Way.
My way. And now the end is near, and so I face the final curtain. The song popularized by Frank Sinatra was one of de Guzman's favorites. Jennifer Wells tells us that when de Guzman got back to his hotel room, after indulging in karaoke accompanied by his drink of choice, rum and coke, he ran a bath and got into it fully clothed.
A bottle of cough syrup had been purchased for him because he wasn't feeling well, and then said that he had taken the majority of the bottle of cough syrup and had taken a bath and was somehow soaking wet.
Australian geologist Jim Richards told me a similar story.
So I used to hang out a bit with Greg McDonald, who was a logistics guy at Bre-X.
Greg McDonald worked for Rudy Vega, de Guzman's metallurgist. Vega was one of the last people to see de Guzman alive. Vega shared details with McDonald of de Guzman's last morning, who then told the story to Jim Richards. Vega's alleged recollection of de Guzman's last day have been widely retold ever since.
He hammered on de Guzman's door, trying to get de Guzman out of bed or ready for the flight, which would have been very early. And eventually de Guzman came to the door and he was still wearing his clothes from the night out the night before, but they were all soaking wet. De Guzman's demeanor when he answered the door was scared, and he believed that de Guzman was trying to take his own life by drowning himself in the bath, and that's why he was soaking wet.
It was time to get on the chopper. Exhausted after their night out, de Guzman and Vega dozed until they touched down in Samarinda at 9:40 a.m. It was arranged that a fresh shirt and blue jeans were waiting there for de Guzman so he could finally change out of his wet clothes. Several witnesses also report seeing a big black box being taken onto the helicopter while it was refueling. No one knows what was in it. De Guzman then decided to use his satellite phone to ring his wife, Jeannie.
Telepon. Kita punya telepon satelit.
We had satellite phones even though he's in the jungle. Even before he boarded the helicopter, he said, "Ma, I'm leaving, yeah? Ma, it looks like the pilot who brought my helicopter was not the usual pilot, and the mechanic was also not the usual ones." He was like, "Ma, why are the pilot and the mechanic different?" I told him it's okay. I thought, maybe they had an upset tummy. We like to make jokes. Maybe they need to go to the toilet, Pa. Then he laughed. "Okay, Ma, I will call again." We like making jokes, so we don't have any bad thoughts.
Bercanda. Jadi kita nggak ada punya ini gitu kan.
At 10 a.m., De Guzman reboarded the helicopter. Geologist Jim Richards again.
This was the moment of truth for De Guzman. De Guzman was caught like a rat in a trap. If he got off that chopper at the other end, there was nothing he could have said to other geologists that would have convinced them that it was anything other than a scam.
At Busang, Dave Potter had been waiting 4 days for De Guzman's arrival. In the hot and humid conditions, his patience was being tested. But then, a message came through. It was De Guzman.
He called on the radio, and I happened to be in the radio room. He said he was in the helicopter on his way to the Bre-X job site. So he was flying from San Marinda out to the Bre-X job site. I said, ask him, when are you going to be here? And he said, shortly. And they started talking back and forth in their native language. All I know that I was a little bit aggravated with him. And I was a little bit aggravated with the radio operator as well, because he was not being overly helpful. I had to yell at him a little bit because they were talking in Tagalog, and I said, no, speak English, I want to hear what's going on. I said, I need to know when you're going to be here. 20, 25 minutes later, if it was that long, that they told me that he jumped out of a helicopter.
This is from the Police Department, Investigation Department in the Republic of Indonesia, dated March 19th, 1997.
Jennifer Wells managed to get a hold of a police report filed shortly after De Guzman's death.
On March 19th, 1997, at about 10:30 Central Indonesia time, in the village of Mara Common Subdistrict, Kutai District, East Kalimantan, a Philippine citizen named Michael Antonio De Guzman, 43 years old, operational manager of PT Bre-X, fell from a helicopter belonging to the airline PT Indonesia Air Transport. At 10:30 Central Indonesia time, helicopter was flying at an altitude of 800 feet and a speed of 95 knots when the left rear door opened widely with a loud noise. Pilot pitched down to reduce the speed and at the same time looked back and saw that Michael Antonio De Guzman was no longer in his seat.
News of De Guzman's fall reached Freeport. Dan Bowman, Freeport's lawyer, was sitting in a conference room with executives talking about how they were going to build the mine.
And one by one, the secretary would come in and call somebody out. And I thought that was a bit strange because this is a pretty important meeting. And then somebody else went, and I was the last one there, and I was the most junior person. And I'm thinking, what's going on here? And then they called me out, and I hear on the speakerphone this muffled voice saying, De Guzman jumped. And it was Potter. You know, I was just shocked. I couldn't believe it.
Dave Potter was also in shock.
I have to admit I didn't believe it at first because, you know, this was something that was coming over radio and I didn't see a body fall out of a helicopter. So that's hard for me to say, oh, yes, that really happened. And then judging by the reaction of some of the people at the site, They were shocked when they heard about it. And then I started thinking to myself, damn, maybe this guy really did do this. Then I started thinking, no, for my own sanity, I can't believe that, because I just find it so distasteful to think that rather than talk to me, somebody would kill themselves. I have no idea who the pilot was or what the helicopter was. He never did come to the Bre-X job site. So that's a bit of a mystery for me.
After a couple of hours, Dave Potter got a telephone call from the president of Freeport, Indonesia.
And he was concerned for our safety. And he said, Dave, you need to get out of there. He said, we just heard that Mike de Guzman jumped out of a helicopter, and he said, things are getting really strange. And he said, I want you to get the crew out of there.
At that time, when a mine suddenly shut down, it wasn't uncommon for hostages to be taken. This was the workers' way of making sure they got paid.
I spent about an hour because they were scattered. So it took me a bit of time to get people all gathered around and get our helicopter. And by that point in time, I also had 3 Kopassus bodyguards that followed me around like dogs. They were interesting guys.
Dave Potter's Indonesian Special Forces bodyguards were a sign that things could get ugly.
There was this big thunderstorm rolling in, and lightning crashing and rain coming down. You could see it. I was starting to get a little worried because the pilot told me, he said, if this storm hits, we're not going anywhere. And I said, oh dear. And we speeded everybody up, got everybody thrown in the helicopter and jumped in and lifted off. And the rain started just as we lifted off, and we turned around and flew away from the storm. So we flew out of the gust front, and it followed us for a while. It was chasing us, kind of an omen.
Potter flew into Samarinda, where a private jet arranged by Freeport's Indonesian president, Audrey McCribby, was waiting.
The whole crew, dirty, stinking, and crawled in this luxurious private jet, and he flew us back to Jakarta. I drove immediately to the office. Audrey said, come and see me, and I got there, and it was essentially like, what in the world has happened? The first thing that comes out of everybody's mouth is, what did you do? Didn't do anything, Audrey. Mike de Guzman fell out of the helicopter, and then Audrey said, no, he jumped. We were all kind of going, what? What?
Jakarta journalist John Macbeth had been following the highs and lows of the Bre-X saga for years when one evening, while drinking in the bar of the Shangri-La Hotel, he was tapped on the shoulder by one of his sources, ex-CIA agent Richard Jacobson.
And his first words to me was, what if I told you that de Guzman was dead? And I just about dropped my beer, to tell the truth. And I said, well, he filled me in a little on the detail, and I just fled. I went straight back to the office. We called the East Kalimantan police, who confirmed that de Guzman was dead. And I had it on the Dow Jones newswires hours ahead of the opposition. It was one of the best scoops you could ever get, frankly.
For months, John Macbeth had been keeping investment banker Warren Irwin informed daily on the latest Bre-X intel. Warren Irwin had invested millions in Bre-X.
I get a call in the middle of the night. Warren, it's John. So what's up? Warren, de Guzman's dead. They killed him. And I'm going, what? Yeah, they threw him out of a helicopter. Who did it? Who killed him? I said, the Indonesians. I said, wow. My nerves by this point, completely shot. I don't know what end is up. So I'm going, okay, as soon as the market opens, I'm selling everything. I never want to hear about Bre-X again. This is over for me. I don't want any part of this. Sure enough, stocks halted. Halted all morning. And I'm going, oh man, I can't do anything. I'm sitting there with half of my position still. So I phone up the company in Jakarta, and I go, so what happened to Mike? And they go, well, he fell out of the helicopter. I said, well, can you tell me where it happened? They said, well, it happened between San Marinda and the site. And I said, well, I've seen the pre-flight inspection. Nobody falls out of a helicopter, given the tight pre-flight inspection. So I said, oh, man, that doesn't sound right.
Back in Canada, the brokers wanted to believe that de Guzman had accidentally fallen from the helicopter. They wanted to prevent a crash in shares. They continued to push the stock.
The news release comes out. Then mining analysts started telling me, oh, Warren, oh, yeah, you know how these geologists get. They get a little lax with safety when you're hopping around from site to site, on the site, going from drill place to drill place. They don't buckle in. He just fell out. I said, nope, that didn't happen. He went from San Marinda to the site. He would have been buckled in 100%. There's something seriously wrong here. So I went in, I sold all my stock at the equivalent of, I think about that point, it sold off a little bit, about $220 or $210 a share.
Then, a handwritten suicide note, supposedly written by de Guzman, was discovered in de Guzman's belongings from the helicopter. As news spread, people assumed de Guzman had taken his own life. But not everyone believed it.
I don't believe the suicide letter for 2 seconds, because I was at the Prospectors and Developers Association conference in Toronto, the largest mining conference in the world. Mike de Guzman was there with all the other GOs, with probably half a dozen hookers, having the time of his life. And he was partying up so hard, I knew there's no way he was suicidal. Trust me on this one.
After de Guzman's fall, Bre-X shares plummeted, but then rallied. Bre-X, suspicious of Freeport's drill results and motives, decided to start their own due diligence. Meanwhile, Freeport were determined to find out why they couldn't find any gold. And several locals and geologists from the job site began scouring the jungle for de Guzman's body, all while the rest of the world were asking, what happened?